Good morning, everyone. Hello, hello.
Good morning.
Hi.
Good morning, Crystal.
Good morning.
Good morning, Hillary. All right, well, I think that's everybody out of our waiting room, and I'll just continue to let people in as they come. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are here today for our next installment of Let's Connect, and today we are connecting with Mike Boreale. Before I let Dave get into it a little bit, I would just like to go over a couple of really quick housekeeping rules. Please, everyone, go ahead and mute yourself. Even if you're, in a quiet room by yourself, still do please mute yourself, just, to kind of make sure we don't have any errant sneezes or coughs or coffee spills pop up in the middle of our Zoom. Also, if you would like to real quick put your information in the chat, if you want to, you don't have to, and this will get sent out to everybody who is in attendance today. So if you want people to have your information, go ahead and put your name, your title, your business, and your contact information, and that will get sent out to everyone. And I would appreciate it if you do that first thing if you're going to, so that way when people do submit questions, it doesn't get mixed up. So let people take the first couple of minutes to enter their contact information. And then after that, please feel free to go ahead and put your questions in the chat. And I will communicate those to Dave, who will then, he's going to be our moderator today, who will ask them to Mike. So I think that's all I have. Again, thanks for joining us. And here is our President and CEO, Dave Perry.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And we'll spend about an hour or so of our time. We sure appreciate Mike Boreale, who's our speaker today about vaccine. Mike has been a great friend of our chamber for a long time. He's done some legal work on our behalf. Boreale Law is a Tucson-based law firm that provides flat fee and fixed price services to small and medium-sized businesses, with a focus on business, employment, real estate, and international law matters. His goal is to partner with his clients to help grow their businesses, and I'll vouch firsthand that Mike's been a great help to us. He's been 15 years in the practice. He's had a varied background with labor and employment law, business formations, contracts, real estate, immigration, and estate planning. He previously served as in-house counsel attorney with the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. He's an undergraduate degree from the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, and he's got his law degree from the University of Arizona. So, Mike, thank you so much for being with us. He's going to make a presentation with PowerPoint, and we sure welcome him and all of you to be here with us today.
Thanks, Dave. I really appreciate it, and I'm happy to be here and looking forward to helping answer some of your questions. I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to share, and it will be pretty quick. We'll run through it just to get the basic kind of legal landscape, and then we'll move on into questions. Keep in mind, these, as you'll hear during the PowerPoint, these matters are really fact specific and company specific, and so the answers today are going to be general. We can't get into the level of detail that we would in a regular consult, but I'll do my best to convey as much information to you to help you make some decisions. So with that said, let me share my screen, and hopefully we tested this earlier and it worked, so hopefully it works again. And all right, so that's my little cover sheet. Okay. So we'll cover a few topics. So the first will be the vaccine and legal landscape, just talking about, what's available, what does it look like from a standpoint as far as, what employers need to consider when developing policies. We'll look at disability considerations under the ADA, different questions you can ask, reasonable accommodations. The other major issue would be a religious-based objections. We'll talk about that. We'll briefly talk about, union workforces and agreements. There aren't too many union employers in the Tucson area. So, if that applies to you, great, but it's just something to know. And then some best practices that we found just with helping our clients develop these policies and kind of structure their, return to work. So, all right. So I guess when we're talking about, requiring employees to get vaccines, I think the first question that we have to answer is, are vaccines available for them? And so that is something that, obviously it depends on the industry that you're in. So if your company, is in healthcare, or, senior care, certain high risk industries, those are, the phase 1A, now into phase 1B. And then, little by little, it's, I don't think we're in 1C yet, but that's, kind of the allotment. And so, are your employees in a high risk category? Is your industry in a high risk category? So these are questions that, if you require vaccines too soon before they're readily available, obviously you're going to have employees that aren't able to receive them. And so that's going to have to be the first consideration. So I'd recommend, unless you're in an industry that's like a healthcare related industry, you probably wouldn't want to consider a company-wide vaccine requirement until vaccines are readily available. So probably summertime. So the second main consideration is, unless you have a written employment contract or a labor agreement or something like that, most employees in Arizona are what's called at will. And what that means is that they can be terminated or quit at any time for any reason, with or without notice. The only reason you can't terminate someone is an unlawful reason, so discriminatory reason. But you could conceivably terminate people because they are wearing a checkered shirt today. As silly as that sounds, that may be a valid reason to terminate somebody in Arizona because it's at will. So by extension, if you can terminate them for wearing a checkered shirt, you can also probably terminate them for not getting a vaccine. And so the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, they've issued guidance about vaccines in the workplace. And although COVID is new, we're not totally flying blind, because we've had flu vaccines and other types of vaccines for many, many years. And so there are various employers that have required flu vaccines in the past. And so there has been some legal, case law and some, legal policies developed to guide employers in this area, pre-COVID. It's just getting obviously a lot more publicity now. But generally speaking, employers can require employees to be vaccinated before returning to a workplace. Typically, you'll see this in hospital setting or something like that, where employers have for years required, let's say, nurses to get flu vaccines. And so the same kind of analysis is going to translate to COVID. Now, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, a flu vaccine is available in any Walgreens or CVS whenever you want. So that's pretty easy. The COVID at this stage is not as readily available, but as that becomes readily available, then the flu vaccine kind of arguments make more sense. And so, whoops, sorry about that. So, the policy has to comply with the law that applies to your business. And the two main ones are the Americans with Disabilities Act and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So the ADA obviously deals with accommodations and non-discrimination for individuals that have disabilities. And then Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, this covers general prohibition on discrimination for, sex, race, color, ethnicity, national origin, and religion. And then the religion is what we'll talk about for this purpose. So we'll start with the ADA though. So one of the issues that we run into with the ADA is that while you are able to require certain things of your employees, there are also certain prohibitions on what you can ask from them. So before an employee asks for a reasonable accommodation, you can't just require all of your employees to get a medical exam or ask about their health, things like that, unless it's job related. So for instance, if you have a very physical workplace and they need to be able to lift, a certain amount of weight, I mean, you can ask them if they're, capable of lifting that weight. That's related to the business. But asking about, health history or, their overall health, those things are usually not a good idea. I would say usually they're not a good idea. So, probably don't want to ask. Now, once an employee requests an accommodation, which we'll talk about, then the employer has more leeway to get into those discussions. But at the outset, not necessarily the way you want to go. Now, the EEO has said that, giving a vaccine to someone or requiring somebody to show that they've been vaccinated isn't a medical exam, and it's not an inquiry into their health, and so that's okay. Now, the ADA is not automatic, so the employee generally has to request an accommodation under the ADA. The employer can't impose an accommodation on an employee. And so if you had a policy requiring vaccines and the employee said, I'm requesting, an exemption from that due to my, health issues, that the employee doesn't have to say a magic word to say, I am requesting a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. It's what, a reasonable employer would take that to mean, someone saying, I don't want to do this because of my health issues, that they're asking for an exemption to a policy. And that is an accommodation, even though they didn't say the word accommodation. And so, you have to be careful as far as the follow-up questions that you're asking, and how much you're prying into their medical history. You can certainly request proof if they say, and you don't have to be deaf to what the employee tells you. So if the employee provides information about their health history, you can utilize that information in your decision-making. You don't have to just, ignore it. Pre-screening questions, again, this could be dangerous if you're either interviewing people and, asking them if they're able to get a vaccine, or if the employer itself is asking questions about whether they're eligible for the vaccine and things like that. That would be probably crossing a line as far as what you can do. Now, if you refer them to a third party and they're asking those questions, that's fine. And that's in most cases, I mean, unless you're in a hospital or a healthcare setting, it's unlikely that the employer is actually administering the vaccine directly. And also there's another act that's related to the ADA, but it's called GINA, which is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And that prevents discrimination based on family or genetic kind of medical history. So saying, do you have relatives that, have cancer or have health conditions or diabetes, and are you more susceptible to that? Those are questions you should not be asking. So, if someone does, make a request to be exempted, if you have a policy, can you exclude that person from the workplace and say, you cannot come into work until you have been vaccinated? So I'll give you the most common lawyer answer. It depends. It depends on factors like, what is the job that employee does? Is the employee, in a situation where if they're not vaccinated, they could cause, harm to, customers or to other employees or things like that? Are they in a type of job that can be accommodated, such as, working from home? So, if you have an employee that can do, the essential functions of their job from home, that may be, and they don't want to get vaccinated because of a disability, then working from home may be a reasonable accommodation. So you would eliminate the threat to other people by allowing them to work from home. But if they're in the type of job where they cannot work from home, and let's say the most common area, a nurse or, some sort of like senior care, where you're saying, look, if you're not vaccinated, you bring that the virus in, a patient or, a resident could become sick or die. That's a direct threat. That's a significant risk of harm. And so, a widespread vaccination policy in a healthcare setting for a nurse who's doing, direct hands-on patient care is going to probably stand up to scrutiny better than something where someone's just reviewing medical records off-site and can do that from home. And so you're looking at, what's the type of risk, the nature and severity, the likelihood, and, imminence. Is this something that is going to happen right away or is likely to happen right away? So reasonable accommodations, as I mentioned, if there's if there's no way to provide a reasonable accommodation to eliminate the risk, then, you don't have to grant the exemption. And if the ADA defines a reasonable accommodation is one that does not pose an undue hardship on the employer. And so an undue hardship is a significant difficulty or expense. It can also mean a risk to other people. And so there are defenses. So an employer, just because an employee requests an accommodation does not mean that accommodation is reasonable, and does not mean the employer has to provide it. And that's where I'm saying, this is on a case-by-case basis. It depends on, the employee who's asking, their condition that they're using, as the basis for their disability, the type of job that they're doing. So there is no automatic, answer in every case. It really is very specific to that scenario. But the employer has to consider, once the request is made, you have to, actually consider, are there alternative accommodations? So someone says, I don't want to get the vaccine because of my disability, and you're saying we have a policy requiring it. Is there a way to modify their job, or offer them an alternative position or something like that? That could be an accommodation as well. Not necessarily the employee's preferred accommodation, but one that would address the issue. At the end of the day, an accommodation just means a change to how the employer does things, whether that's a written policy or a custom. It's a change to that. And so, we get the question all the time, we can't provide special treatment. The ADA is saying, yes, you have to provide special treatment to employees that meet certain criteria. And similar to that, Title VII under the Civil Rights Act also uses the term accommodation, though it's slightly different. So if an employee has a sincerely held religious belief that prevents them from being vaccinated, they can request an accommodation. And again, accommodation being, a change in a policy. So if you have a policy saying 100% of employees must be vaccinated, the employee with a religious exemption is saying, I'm requesting a change to that policy because of my sincerely held religious belief. This is, it's somewhat difficult to get into, to someone's mind and say, do they have a sincere religious belief? But they do have to explain, what is their religious teaching that, prevents them from, receiving a vaccine. Again, you have this undue hardship defense, similar to what you did under the ADA as an employer. The undue hardship burden under Title VII is much lower. So if it's more than a de minimis cost or burden on the employer, then it's an undue hardship. So changing a policy in and of itself is probably not an undue hardship because it doesn't cost the employer anything. But if the employer can show that, changing that policy, same analysis as before, if that would put other employees at risk, patients, customers, things like that, the employer may be able to deny that accommodation. But if that's not the case, then they probably would have to, make that accommodation or look again, are there alternatives that would allow the employee to continue doing the job, such as working from home. But the analysis has to be done, and we recommend, documenting that, making it clear, what are the conversations that are happening, what are the facts that you receive, and kind of that decision-making process. So if there was a claim later that you failed to accommodate, it helps for the employer to have documentation to show, these are the steps that we took to analyze this, and this is the conclusion that we came to. So the other thing that can affect a policy would be a labor agreement. So if there is a collective bargaining agreement in place that governs, terms and conditions of employment, something that would subject employees to discipline. So like failing to get vaccinated by a certain time, that certainly could, modify the employer's ability to kind of just establish a mandatory vaccine policy unilaterally. They may have to come to the table, discuss it with the union and kind of bargain as to how that's going to be implemented and so forth. Depending on the contract, depending on the industry, there may be exceptions to that, but just something to keep in mind. So best practices, obviously vaccines are not, everywhere yet. You can't just go to the pharmacy and get a vaccine. So you have to think about, when will employees be able to get vaccines? And so you can certainly recommend. There's nothing that prevents the employer from encouraging employees or incentivizing employees. So we have, some employers are conditioning, paid leave on, getting vaccinated. We've had others that are, offering, either monetary bonuses or, additional time off or things like that, just to, try to get employees to do it voluntarily. Obviously, we have other protocols that have been in place for the last year, before the vaccine was issued that, have been effective in many circumstances. So, do you have a mask requirement, social distancing, alternative work schedules, hybrid work schedules, a lot of different things that you can do to minimize exposure in the workplace, even if people aren't vaccinated. And then, the decisions, as I mentioned, these the analysis of these employment laws and the ADA, these are very fact specific and they're very layered and complex. So, a plug for myself and any other employment lawyer is, it can be helpful to consult with somebody who, can apply that, objectively to your situation. And then the last decision, depending on, is it a, at-will employment? What are the circumstances? Are you automatically terminating the employee? Will you have, an unemployment claim, to deal with? But a little preparation can go a long way in making sure that you're making the best decision, in examining all the options and, are alternatives possible? And that's usually, going to be a good idea, is at least make an effort to look for alternatives. May not, may happen in some cases, may not be available in others, even in the same company, because of different job duties. So that's certainly helpful to have that level of detail. So they asked me to keep that to about 15 minutes. I think I went a little over, but that's about it for my presentation.
Mike, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? We keep your questions coming through chat. And Mike, I've got a question right away, and it's a kind of a broad question that applies to so many of us. For the past year, our company has allowed employees to work from home. Ideally, our business requires interaction with clients more face-to-face. And the question becomes, when the vaccine is available, does that mean that the employer can say, get the vaccine and then come back and work and do the work as we originally envisioned it to be?
So the short answer is probably yes. The main thing to keep in mind is, the employer has certain responsibilities. One thing, we didn't touch on is OSHA, occupational safety. The employer has certain responsibilities to provide a safe workplace for their employees. And so if the employee, or the employer can take reasonable safety measures. We have guidance from the CDC about return to work. And so there's nothing that says, at this point, all employees must work remotely. That's going to be a decision that employers are going to have to make based on, how equipped are they to provide, can they provide masks? Can they socially distance in the workplace? What is the nature of the work? So assuming that the employer can do that and adding vaccines, into that, then I think, yes, they can say, hey, we're returning to work on, April 1st. And if an employee does not want to go to work, then it's up to the employee to request an accommodation to say, I don't want to get vaccinated, or I don't want to come to work because of X, Y, and Z. And then that would start that whole analysis that I mentioned. So, refusing to get the vaccine and refusing to come to work when ordered would, assuming it's based on a disability or a religious objection, you're less likely to see a religious objection. Most of the time we've seen it based on a disability. You still have to do the analysis on employee by employee basis. But for the vast majority, yeah, you can say, hey guys, you know what? We've got it under control. This is what we have for you. And, April 1st, we're live again. That's certainly good. And with respect to the job duties, there have been recent cases, stating that physical presence at the workplace is an essential function of a lot of jobs. And so, if that's an essential function, the employer may have more leeway to deny a reasonable accommodation, depending on the job. Now, if an employee's been doing their job remotely for a year, without any downgrade in performance or productivity, it may be harder for the employer to justify one or the other. But again, it depends on the, there's not going to be a requirement that, everyone is working remotely perpetually forever.
Thanks, Mike. I've got another question here, and I'm messing up on my stuff here. By the way, while I'm looking for the questions, in an at-will environment like this, Mike, if somebody said, I'm not going to come to work, and they haven't claimed a ADA exemption or a religious exemption, I could just say, well, we're going to terminate the working relationship. That's still a possibility, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the definition of the at-will nature of employment, is that, the employee can choose not to work as much as the employer can choose to terminate an employee. And so in that circumstance, if the employer is open for business and the employee refuses to come in and doesn't request an accommodation, then most likely that's just going to be the employee's quitting or abandoning their job. Sure.
Somebody has asked about the question regarding how do you define a significant expense in terms of making accommodation? And the example that this individual shared is, if I've got somebody who's working at home and that's the way it's going to be, and I've got to get a satellite service for internet connection, that probably could be an expensive thing. Is there a sort of a framework for significant expense definition?
Unfortunately, there's not, a specific dollar amount. Generally, it's related to the size of the employer is a big factor. So, a one person, a small, I'd say one person, but because they're probably not covered by the ADA anyway, but let's say, a 15-person company that would be covered by the ADA generally can't do as much as a 1,500-person corporation. And so, what's a hardship for the 15-person company is probably not a hardship for the 1,500-person company. That said, the employer, doesn't necessarily have to have, it's not only a dollar amount. It's also, do they have to assign a technical person to monitor this person's internet connection? What are the resources that are being diverted? So it's all kind of factors in more than just a money number.
Great. Here's a great question, and one I think that applies to many people. My organization has both employees and volunteers in the workforce. can we require the volunteers to have the vaccine before they continue working?
So volunteers are not employees, and so employment laws don't generally cover volunteers, and there's no right to volunteer at your chosen charity. And so if that's a condition of being a volunteer, so let's say, I mean, put it in another context, if your organization said, all volunteers must submit to a fingerprint and a background check. Let's say you're working with children or something like that. They have no right to say, oh, I'm not going to do that, I still want to volunteer. You can say, sorry, if you don't pass your background check, you cannot volunteer here. This isn't, I don't think it's any different, because the volunteer doesn't even have as much of a claim. So a volunteer can't claim an ADA accommodation. So that's, a volunteer can't claim a religious accommodation because it applies to employees.
Good. Can an employer mandate unvaccinated employees to wear 2 masks, as has recently been recommended by the Centers for Disease Control?
I think so. That goes kind of back to the OSHA requirements, and there are, if there are guidance from public health, that the employer is just requiring employees to follow that guidance. Likewise, employers can choose to follow a lesser standard of from the guidance, but they may run a risk in doing one way or the other. So it's just, they certainly could require something that is reasonable, and following published guidance is probably reasonable.
Can an employer require employees to be COVID tested to return to work when they have taken time off?
I would say yes in most cases, because it would help to show that the employee could pose a risk to others. So depending on the nature of the workplace, I mean, if an employee is working 100% remotely from their house, obviously requiring them to have a COVID test doesn't make a lot of sense. But if an employee is working with groups of people, they can't socially distance, or they're dealing with customers, in close contact. Yeah, I mean, I think it's logical and reasonable for an employer to, cover their bases that way. Now, other question would be, who's paying for that test? Is the employer paying for it versus the employee? That's requires a little more analysis, but I think generally speaking, the Pima County health guidance, they often recommend, these tests. So tests are readily available, unlike the vaccines. And so I think that's a reasonable request.
And as part of that question, the questioner asked, if testing is required, are there local resources that test for free? And I believe that the Ellie Town Center at Flowing Wells continues to offer free testing to people on this side of Tucson, and we'll try to generate some other resources there. Keep your questions coming. I have one, Mike. If I tell my employees that they need to be vaccinated and somebody says no, and they raise the specific objections, do I have an obligation as the employer to tell their coworkers that that individual is not vaccinated?
Well, so that gets very tricky, Dave. That's an excellent question. The employer, has an obligation to, not just the employee who's requesting the accommodation, but also to the other employees. Likewise, they also have a duty to, keep medical information, private. And so typically we advise, so when this comes up in the nature of a positive test, we advise employers, they have to notify their other employees who may have been exposed, but they don't need to do that in a way that specifically identifies the employee. So you can say, you can put out general information to employees and say, hey, on Tuesday, you may have been exposed to, someone that's positive for coronavirus or positive for COVID. You can do that without saying, hey, on Tuesday, we learned that John Doe is COVID positive and you're working with John, so you better get a test. There's different ways to do that diplomatically. So we recommend providing as as minimal information as possible without identifying the employee. That said, if you're in a small office or something like that, they probably can figure it out. That you can't prevent them from making inferences. But as far as the employee who refuses to get tested, I think that would go back to, are they endangering their coworkers, and is excluding them from the workplace the right solution? So just because someone refuses to get vaccinated does not mean they have the right to go back and do their regular job with everyone else. And so that's where that balance comes in. It's like, okay, if you don't want to get vaccinated because you have a religious exemption, are we able to accommodate you without risk, endangering your coworkers? And if the answer to that is no, then you probably don't need to accommodate, because again, the reasonable term gives the employer some ability to push back or balance and do that analysis. It's not just, I request accommodation, I have to get my accommodation, I'm going to work. Can't do that.
Sure, and you think about the complexities, and every situation is going to be different, but we have an obligation as employers to protect everybody who works for us, and I don't want an employee saying, hey, you exposed me to the virus because that person wasn't vaccinated and was still allowed to come to work. So it's tricky.
Yeah, it's definitely, and then there's, obviously we have other measures, to protect employees. So, does the employer, so I guess the worst scenario for the employer would be, okay, everyone's vaccinated, so nobody has to, we're not going to require masks, we're not going to require social distancing anymore, so just go back to normal. And then you throw in an employee who's not vaccinated into the mix. That's going to be problematic. I think it's less problematic if the employee says, well, hey, you know what? We need to maintain, we're still going to require masks and we're still going to require social distancing for some amount of time. The risk to other employees, I think, is probably minimized, especially if they've been doing it that way for a long period of time. So if everyone's already been going to work, wearing masks and doing that, I think the employers met their burden to keep other employees safe. So we have to distinguish between, not getting the vaccine and being actually COVID positive, or not getting the vaccine and, that's not going to cause others to automatically get sick. There are other kind of in-between measures that the employer needs to analyze based on their workplace, the layout of their offices. I mean, there's a ton of things that we would look at.
Here's a question about sick time. And can an employer require an employee to use their banked sick time to quarantine after they've traveled abroad, and even if they've had a negative test?
So there are guidelines as far as, how long should employers have people quarantine, based on a potential exposure or a high risk activity. And it varies between, 14 days, I think at the max, kind of 10 days in between. I think 7 days is kind of the shortest. And a lot of that is either test dependent. So like if you're exposed or potentially exposed and you haven't had a test, then usually I think it's 14 days from the date of exposure. If you don't have symptoms and you had a negative test, I think it's 7 days. So that's kind of the short end. If you have symptoms and you had a negative test, it's closer to 14. So there's a chart that Pima County provides that's pretty helpful. Unfortunately, the only place I can find it is in the extremely tiny print. So I would share it on my screen, but I don't think anybody would be able to read it. But to answer the question, I think, again, that would go back to, listen, if you traveled abroad and so you're, potential exposure, traveling on an airplane, close contact with, a lot of people, that certainly is a high risk activity. And so I think the employer can essentially give the employee options and say, listen, I want you to get a test. If you're negative, fine. you can come back. If the employee refuses to get a test for some reason, I think you can say, look, well, I want you to quarantine then for the CDC recommended 14 days. And then the employee has the option of, if they have sick leave available and they still want to get paid, using the sick leave, to replace that time. And then it's a slight variation depending if it's a salaried employee versus an hourly employee. So those factor in as well. But ultimately, tests are readily available. The employee certainly can get a test in a day or two and get a result quickly. So in that scenario, I think that's the employee just refusing to get a test, which I don't think that they would have a real, I wouldn't necessarily know what the accommodation, if there was a ADA request that they shouldn't be allowed to test. I don't know that that's, it's possible, but that would probably be the scenario.
Mike, at some point in time, the mandate to wear masks is going to be lifted in the county. And the question is asked, can an employer require unvaccinated people to wear masks even after the mandate has passed?
That's a very good question. I think the risk that we run in that scenario would be, are we singling out the employee, or if it's based on an ADA request, would that rise to the level of discriminatory? I think you probably could fashion a policy that's not discriminatory to say, like, if you have not, been vaccinated for any reason, then you need to, wear the mask, and unless and until you've been vaccinated. It's probably something that could be fashioned and still be, legally sound. But again, I think it would depend a lot on what's the justification, what's the workplace look like, what's the interaction with people. So I think certainly, an employer, even in the absence of a mask mandate, from the government, because it's at will employment, and an employer could require a mask of employees, just like an employer could require, a blue shirt of employees. And so I think when you get into at will employment, the employer does have that flexibility that's not necessarily dependent on what the county says. The county ordinance certainly strengthens the employer's policy to say, well, we have to do this. But even after that, I think the employer probably could have a policy that requires it. You just would want to be careful of potential discrimination claims.
And along that line, Mike, somebody's asking a really important question about the consistency of applying rules. If an employer says these are the rules, but not all individuals are following them, and it makes me uncomfortable, do I have rights to say, I'm not going to work because you're not uniformly applying the rules? So
that's something that we stress, with our clients tremendously, is, the best defense from a discrimination claim is to not discriminate. And by that, I don't mean that it's malicious. I just mean treating everyone the same. And so when you have a rule that's uniformly applied, it's much harder for an employee to come back and say, I was treated differently because of, my age, sex, race, religion, disability, whatever the case may be. Now, if the employee, if the employer is granting exemptions to the rule that's otherwise enforced because of accommodations, legitimate accommodations, that's their job. The employer has to do that. But if the employer is just picking and choosing who has to follow rules and who doesn't without a basis, it could form the potential for a discrimination claim. And so that's always risky to do that. On the employee side, it probably would not prevent an employer from terminating that employee, but it could give the employee a basis for either, an unemployment claim to say that they were wrongfully terminated because, the rule wasn't uniformly applied. So that's a big issue with unemployment claims, that an employer has to uniformly apply their rules in order to use it as a justification to terminate somebody. But on the on the discrimination side, is there something different about that employee or other employees that were given a free pass? So it can be problematic. It's possible, but it has risk.
Somebody makes a comment that might lead to a question. In senior living, we test weekly, but are not requiring all employees to be vaccinated. And that individual is suggesting it's a mistake because you would have exposure of the rest of the team to somebody that may have the virus. And Mike, are you making recommendations as legal resource to say to people, you should get everybody vaccinated, or you should require, especially in those higher risk kinds of businesses?
Well, as you mentioned, it's dependent on the type of employer. So we're not categorically recommending that, all of our clients require, vaccinations for all employees. We really are looking at, what are the circumstances, what is the level of risk to the company from, a claim. Again, vaccines are not the only piece of the puzzle. There's also just personal behaviors, there are, social distancing things, masks that we've already discussed. And so, someone that does not receive a vaccine is not automatically going to transmit that to someone else, especially if it's combined with, routine testing. And so the question is the employer acting reasonably? Is the employer properly balancing, the needs of its customers or patients and the employees and its own, desire for, liability protection? So it's a balancing act. So there's not one size fits all by any means. But, we have, vaccines are just one kind of leg of the stool, I guess, or chair. I don't know. The chair might stand with 3 legs, might stand with 4. I don't know.
Like someone's asking if I'm the employer and I require vaccine and an employee has an adverse reaction to vaccine, is the employer exposed with some liability? I don't really deal with, personal injury claims or workers' comp, style claims. Obviously the employer didn't make the vaccine. The employer doesn't have control over, and really can't know that someone may have an adverse reaction. So, I mean, we're relying on, the government has approved this vaccine for use. And so if the employer was requiring someone to get some black market vaccine that wasn't proven, that obviously is a different story. Michael, I'm on a call. Sorry, my son is coming in here, buddy. Get people from the show. Hello.
Not right now. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, not a problem.
Virtual school collides with work stuff. So
sure, we understand.
The idea is, if the requirement for a vaccine is something that is, approved by, the federal government and is a legitimate requirement, I think it's unlikely that the employer would be, facing liability in that circumstance. At most, it would probably be in a workers' comp scenario because it's employment related, in which case, that's going to, limit the employee's damages to, like actual medical expenses and things like that, lost wages, but that would be covered by workers' comp policy. So that's a very interesting question.
It is. And we're going to wrap it up here in a minute, folks. Again, please chat your questions to us and we can try to text some questions to Mike for any follow-ups. And certainly Mike is, he's a great attorney and he'd be available to any of you. And maybe, Mike, I might put a wrap on some of this with an observation from one of our guests today that talks about how tricky it really is to trace contact. And, if I'm working next to somebody who's not vaccinated and I get the virus, I can't prove that I got it from that person next to me. And again, it's such a complicated environment that we're working in, and something that frankly, I don't think any of us have ever seen before. So that's like a comment. It is not in the form of a question, but maybe in your experience, what has this been like for people?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I love about employment law is that it affects everyone in some way. So everyone, either works for someone or has people working for them. And so, most people have exposure to employment law, whether they know it or not. What's changed over the last year is a lot of people, has brought a lot of focus on, these workplace issues. And that's been, exciting for me because, we have to keep up on these things that are changing, weekly, monthly, there's so many different things that are happening. So for us to be good resources for our clients, we have to learn and really try to stay on top of everything that's happening. So that's been a challenge, but it's been an exciting challenge over the last year. And I've seen, we saw initially, very big spike in probably April, May, with calls related to, kind of essential, when the shutdowns happened, it was, are we an essential business? How do we, keep working? Can we keep our doors open? What do we need to do? That type of question. Then it was more, return to work policies. And, we still see, okay, I had an employee test positive. What do I do? What about, what are quarantine requirements and things like that? And so we just kind of take them as they come, but we've seen the types of questions change. And now as the vaccines are rolling out, now questions are more vaccine related, but a lot of those other things are still floating around, but we see spikes in different topics, every few months. So it's been fun.
Yeah. Mike, we sure want to thank you for your time today and acknowledge to so many of you out there who are having kids at home going to school and we've all become accepting of that. We understand that that's the way life is these days. So ladies and gentlemen, give a verbal wave and a round of applause to Mike Boreale, please, for his time today. Kristen has included some information in the chat, other resources that might be available to you all. We would close by telling you that we've got an evening Zixer, as we're calling them, a week from today, the 25th of February at 5 o'clock, and we'll have information in our digital communications. And then think about us on March the 4th is our Oro Valley Economic Outlook. It's a 9 a.m. event, and it will be both pre-recorded and live and free to all of you. And we're going to talk about the housing market, which is a fascinating and driving force. We're also going to introduce Paul Melcher, who is the new Oro Valley Economic and Community Development Director. And we're going to talk about Oracle Road. The project to rebuild Oracle is at long last starting to our south. And we'll have people from ADOT to talk about what you all might expect in both your businesses and in your commutes. So once again, thank you everybody for your time. We really appreciate it. Hang in there. And if you have any questions or needs that you need to ask of our staff, please let us know. Everybody have a great day.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, everyone. Have a fantastic day.